They thought they could smash other people's cars with impunity. They thought their numerical advantage would make them invincible. But they didn't know who they were targeting. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments what city you're from. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast, sun-scorched expanse of golden sand and jagged rock formations. The highway cut through the emptiness like a scar, a long, straight ribbon of asphalt that shimmered under the oppressive heat. A mirage danced on the horizon, the illusion of water rippling across the distant road, but there was nothing but dust and dry air. Nestled against the highway's edge, an old roadside diner stood defiantly against time and the elements. Its neon sign, once bright and inviting, flickered weakly, struggling against years of neglect. The words Betty's Roadside Grill were barely legible beneath the layers of dust and grime that coated the glass. Despite its worn appearance, the place still held on to a sense of life, an oasis of greasy comfort food and air-conditioned refuge in the middle of nowhere. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few vehicles. An old station wagon sat near the entrance, its faded paint chipping away under the relentless sun. A couple of semi-trucks idled nearby, their drivers either inside eating or resting in the shade. But among them, one vehicle stood out, an imposing black Ford F-650, a beast of a machine that dwarfed everything else around it. Its polished surface gleamed despite the dust swirling in the dry wind, and its massive tires looked as if they could roll over a car without noticing. The reinforced front bumper, the extra layers of metal plating along the doors, and the slight tint of battle-worn scratches hinted that this was no ordinary truck. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the scent of fried food, coffee, and the faint trace of cigarette smoke lingering from an era before smoking bans. The place was modest. Vinyl booths with cracked cushions, a long counter with swiveling stools, and a jukebox in the corner that occasionally sputtered out an old country tune. The hum of conversation was low, mostly truckers and weary travelers exchanging quiet words over their meals. The only sounds that truly stood out were the clinking of cutlery against plates and the distant whir of the ceiling fan. Seated in the farthest booth, his back against the wall, was a man who commanded attention without trying. Broad-shouldered, with a frame that seemed too large for the booth, he ate with the slow, deliberate ease of someone who wasn't in a hurry. His tanned hands were thick with muscle, his fingers strong but controlled as he cut into a perfectly seared steak. His face was rugged, marked with the faint lines of experience rather than age. Beneath his Stetson hat, piercing eyes moved with a calculated awareness, taken in the surroundings without seeming to. Chuck Norris didn't need to make a scene to be noticed. His presence alone was enough. He had been here for about an hour, enjoying the simple pleasure of a well-cooked meal. He wasn't in a rush. There was nowhere he needed to be, no deadline to meet. The desert roads stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. He had spent years moving from place to place, and today was no different. Sometimes a man just needed a quiet moment to eat his steak in peace. Outside, the afternoon sun hung high, baking the landscape into submission. The stillness was absolute, save for the occasional gust of wind that kicked up a swirl of dust. It was the kind of peace that could lull a man into forgetting that trouble had a way of finding him, even when he wasn't looking for it. The first sign of disturbance came as a low, distant growl. It was subtle at first, almost blending in with the sound of the trucks outside, but as the seconds passed, the noise grew louder, an unmistakable rumble, mechanical and hungry, like the growl of a beast wakened from slumber. It was the sound of motorcycle engines, multiple of them, cutting through the desert stillness with a predatory edge. Chuck didn't pause. He simply finished chewing his last bite of steak, calmly took a sip of his iced tea, and continued eating. Through the wide front windows of the diner, the motorcycles appeared, a half-dozen dark figures against the backdrop of sunlit dust. They roared down the highway before slowing as they neared the parking lot. The lead rider, a tall figure clad in leather with a skull-emblazoned vest, raised a hand, signaling the others to spread out. The bikes maneuvered smoothly, circling into position like vultures descending on carrion. Inside, the shift in atmosphere was almost tangible. Conversations died down. The truckers, seasoned men who had seen their fair share of trouble, exchanged wary glances. The waitress, a young redhead with a name tag reading Betty, hesitated as she refilled a cup of coffee, her gaze flicking toward the window. The bikers didn't enter the diner. They weren't here for food. They were here for something else. One of them dismounted, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek. He walked toward the black Ford, whistling as he approached it. His fingers traced the outline of the door, leaving a faint smear of dust. "Nice truck," he muttered under his breath, the words carrying just enough venom to suggest ownership was about to change. A second biker, taller and built like a battering ram, grinned and swung a thick chain over his shoulder. His boots crunched against the gravel as he walked around the vehicle, taking in its reinforced structure. "Rich guy must think he owns the road," he chuckled, his voice dripping with derision. The leader of the group, the man with the skull vest, leaned against his own bike and pulled a cigarette from his pocket. He lit it with slow, deliberate ease, exhaling smoke as he observed his men like a king surveying his court. Inside the diner, Betty set down the coffee pot with slightly shaky hands. "Oh, hell," she whispered, "this ain't good." A couple of truckers exchanged knowing looks but didn't move. No one wanted to get involved with the wrong crowd. Trouble was like wildfire. If you weren't careful, you'd get burned just by standing too close. Chuck's hand, steady and unhurried, reached for his fork. He speared another bite of steak, brought it to his mouth, and chewed thoughtfully. Outside, the bikers made their move. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air as one of them dragged his knife across the truck's paint, leaving a jagged scar along the side. Another swung his chain, letting it slam against the hood with a heavy clang. A third pulled out a switchblade and crouched down, jabbing it into the thick rubber of the front tire. Air hissed out in protest. Inside, Betty gasped. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. Chuck paused mid-bite. For a brief moment, the diner was silent. Then, with a calmness that defied the situation, he set his silverware down on the table. He reached for a napkin, wiped his mouth in a slow, measured motion, and exhaled. Then he stood. The weight of his movement was felt before it was heard. As he pushed back from the table, the leather of his jacket creaked softly, a quiet prelude to something much louder. The hum of conversation ceased entirely. Every eye in the diner turned toward him. Outside, the bikers continued their vandalism, laughing, unaware of what was about to walk through that door. Chuck Norris adjusted his belt, rolled his shoulders, and started toward the exit. The storm had arrived. The sound of the heavy wooden door swinging open was like a gunshot in the unnatural silence of the diner. The clinking of cutlery ceased. The low murmur of conversation was swallowed whole by the moment. The only noise that remained was the faint hum of the jukebox playing an old country tune, an ironic backdrop to what was about to unfold. Chuck Norris stepped out into the scorching afternoon sun. The dry heat wrapped around him like an old companion, but he didn't acknowledge it. His boots struck the wooden planks of the diner's small porch with an unhurried weight, his movement steady and deliberate. He paused at the top step, eyes scanning the scene before him with the same calm detachment of a lion surveying a pack of jackals. The bikers were still laughing, still vandalizing, still utterly unaware of the shift in the air. The man with the knife was finishing his work, the last of the air hissing from the front tire of the truck as he withdrew the blade with a satisfied smirk. The brute with the chain swung it again, this time against the side mirror, shattering the glass. The leader, the one in the skull vest, leaned against his motorcycle, puffing on his cigarette with the smirk of a man who thought he was untouchable. Chuck's gaze moved over each of them, assessing, calculating. He was outnumbered, sure. 6 against 1. But numbers had never meant anything to him. It was always the quality of the man, not the quantity. His boots met the hot gravel of the parking lot, a soft crunch that should have been lost under the sound of the idling motorcycles. And yet, somehow that sound cut through, carried by something heavier than noise, something that existed in the air itself. The biker with the scar on his cheek was the first to notice. He straightened, his lips still curled into that smug grin, but his eyes flicked toward Chuck with a flicker of something that might have been hesitation. He nudged the man beside him, the one holding the chain. "Well, look who decided to join the party," he sneered. The others turned, their grins widening as they registered the sight of Chuck Norris standing before them. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The leader exhaled smoke, letting it drift lazily into the air. "That your truck, old man?" he asked, his voice thick with amusement. Chuck remained silent. The leader chuckled. "Damn shame. Looked expensive." Silence. The man with the knife spun it idly between his fingers, smirking. "What's wrong, cowboy? Cat got your tongue?" Still, Chuck didn't respond. The leader took a final drag of his cigarette before flicking it onto the gravel. He pushed off his bike, stepping toward Chuck with an exaggerated stretch, his muscles rippling under his vest. He was big, bigger than most, but size had never won a fight by itself. "You gonna do something about it?" he taunted, standing just a few feet away now. Chuck exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. Then, finally, he spoke. "You made a mistake." The leader's smirk didn't waver. "Oh, yeah? And what's that?" Chuck tilted his head slightly. "You picked the wrong truck." The leader scoffed. "That so?" Chuck's eyes were like stone. "And the wrong man." For the first time, a crack appeared in the leader's confidence. It was subtle, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something in his eyes. But it was there. The man with the knife took a step forward. "You talk real big for a guy standing alone," he said. "There's 6 of us. You really think you can take us all?" Chuck didn't answer. The leader's smirk returned. He turned slightly, half facing his crew. "I think we got ourselves a real tough guy here," he said, his voice oozing mockery. "Thinks he's some kind of action hero." Laughter rippled through the group. The man with the chain swung it lazily in his hand, the sound of the metal links clinking against each other filling the air. The leader turned back to Chuck. "I tell you what, old man," he said, "we'll give you one chance to walk away. Leave the truck, walk back inside, pretend this never happened." Chuck glanced at the wreckage of his truck, the slashed tires, the shattered mirror, the deep gouge along the side. He looked back at the leader. "No." The leader sighed, shaking his head. "Suit yourself." The man with the knife was the first to lunge. It was the worst mistake of his life. Chuck moved faster than the eye could follow. His hand shot up, catching the biker's wrist in midair. There was no hesitation, no warning, just the raw mechanical efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of violence. A sharp crack filled the air as Chuck twisted the biker's arm in the wrong direction. The knife fell from his fingers, clattering onto the gravel before he could even register what had happened. The biker screamed, fallen to his knees, clutching his now useless limb. The laughter died instantly. For the first time, the bikers looked uncertain. Chuck let the injured man collapse onto the ground before shifting his gaze back to the leader. His voice was calm, as if he were simply stating a fact. 5 left. There was a moment of hesitation. A brief, flickering second where the group considered cutting their losses and walking away. Then the man with the chain snarled and swung. It was the second worst mistake of his life. Chuck caught the chain midair, twisting it around his forearm before yanking the biker forward with terrifying ease. The man stumbled, completely off balance, and Chuck drove his knee into his gut with enough force to lift him off the ground. The biker crumpled. The chain slipped from his fingers, now useless. 4, Chuck said. Panic set in. The brute, the one who had shattered the truck's mirror, charged, lowering his head like a bull. He was all muscle, no strategy. Chuck sidestepped at the last second, pivoting on his heel. As the biker rushed past, Chuck's elbow came down like a hammer against the back of his skull. The biker hit the dirt face first. 3. The last two moved together. One swung a crowbar, the other went for Chuck's legs. It was over in seconds. Chuck ducked under the crowbar, seizing the wrist that held it and twisting. The biker let out a strangled cry before Chuck flipped him over his shoulder, sending him crashing onto the hood of a nearby motorcycle. The last one barely had time to react before Chuck drove a fist into his gut, followed by a sharp uppercut that sent him sprawling. The silence that followed was absolute. 6 men lay on the ground, groaning, clutching injuries, no longer the arrogant wolves they had been moments before. Chuck exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. Then he turned to the leader. The man in the skull vest had gone pale. His bravado had vanished. His fingers twitched slightly, as if considering going for the gun on his hip. Chuck tilted his head. "Go ahead," he said. "Try it." The leader hesitated. Then, slowly, his hand dropped away. "Smart." Chuck nodded. "2 mistakes today," he said. "First, you picked my truck. Second, you thought numbers meant anything." The leader swallowed hard. Chuck took a step closer. "Don't make a third." The leader nodded once. Chuck turned away, walking toward his battered truck. Behind him, the bikers scrambled to pick up their fallen comrades. As Chuck reached for the door handle, he heard the unmistakable sound of boots moving fast behind him. He sighed. He didn't even turn. His elbow shot back. The leader collapsed before he even hit the ground. Chuck glanced down at him. "That," he said, "was the 3rd mistake." He climbed into his truck and drove away. The dust hadn't even settled when Chuck Norris pulled the heavy truck door open and stepped inside. The battered black Ford F-650 groaned slightly under his weight as he settled into the driver's seat, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever. He adjusted the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes scanning the parking lot one last time. Behind him, the bikers were scrambling. Some were groaning in the dirt, others trying to push themselves up on shaky limbs. The leader lay sprawled, clutching his ribs, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. Chuck watched without emotion as the man struggled to roll onto his side, his face contorted in pain and anger. Chuck turned the key in the ignition. The truck's powerful engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the quiet air like the growl of a waking beast. He reached for the gear shift, ready to leave this place and the mess he'd just cleaned up. Then he stopped. A slight shift in the air. The tiniest movement in the reflection of his side mirror. One of them was getting up. The leader. Chuck sighed, his fingers tightening momentarily on the wheel before he released them. He knew this type, too proud to take a loss, too stubborn to know when to stay down. There was always one. Always the fool who thought he had something left to prove. He stepped back out of the truck. The leader was on his knees now, struggling to push himself up. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, staining his teeth as he let out a ragged breath. His gang watched him, waiting, but none of them moved. They knew better. But he didn't. Slowly, he reached for something at his waist. Chuck tilted his head slightly, observing. A knife. It gleamed in the midday sun as the biker pulled it free from its sheath. His knuckles were white around the handle, his chest rising and falling with each strained breath. He wiped the blood from his lips with the back of his hand and forced himself upright, his body swaying slightly from the effort. His eyes locked onto Chuck with raw hatred. Chuck waited. The leader spat onto the dirt, his expression twisting. "This ain't over," he growled, his voice rough from the pain, from the humiliation, from the unbearable weight of defeat. Chuck stepped forward, just once, just enough to make the space between them shrink. The biker flinched but held his ground, his fingers tightening around the blade. Chuck spoke, his voice even, steady and carrying the weight of something that could not be ignored. "It is." The leader's breath hitched. Chuck's gaze didn't waver. "You just don't know it yet." The leader clenched his teeth. "You think you're some kind of legend? Some kind of untouchable ghost?" Chuck didn't answer. "You're just one man," the leader spat. "One man against 6. That's all you are." Chuck took another step forward. This time the leader staggered back. It was involuntary, reflexive. His body moved before his pride could stop it. Chuck had seen that look before. That crack in the armor. The moment when bravado met reality and realized it had made a terrible mistake. "You don't get it," Chuck said finally. The leader glared, waiting. Chuck's voice didn't change. "I wasn't fighting 6 men." A pause. "I was fighting 6 mistakes." The leader's eyes flickered, uncertain. Chuck nodded toward the rest of the gang. "And now they know it." Silence. The wind picked up, kicking loose gravel across the pavement. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting away. They weren't laughing anymore. Chuck took another step forward. The leader gripped the knife tighter, but his breath was shaken now. Chuck's voice remained as steady as ever. "Drop it." The leader hesitated. Chuck didn't. His hand moved like lightning, too fast, too precise, too efficient for the human eye to fully track. One moment, the leader was standing there, knife in hand. The next, his wrist was twisted in a direction it wasn't meant to go, and the knife clattered to the pavement. He gasped, his knees giving out as Chuck released him. Chuck took a slow, measured step back. The leader cradled his wrist, his body trembling, his mind finally catching up to the reality that his mouth had been too stubborn to accept. Chuck looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "Walk away." The leader didn't move. Chuck's voice dropped lower. "Or don't." The words hung in the air, heavy with a certainty that left no room for argument. Slowly, painfully, the leader pushed himself back onto his feet. He stumbled, barely catching himself. He glanced at his gang. None of them met his eyes. Then, finally, he turned, and he walked. Chuck watched him go, watched as the rest of them followed, one by one, picking themselves up, collecting their fallen pride, and limping toward their bikes. Engines rumbled to life, louder than before, masking the silence they didn't dare break. The leader climbed onto his motorcycle last, his body slow, stiff. He didn't look back. And then, with a final roar of engines, they were gone. Chuck exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He turned back to the diner. The people inside had been watching. He could see them through the glass, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Even the waitress, Betty, stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping a half-full pot of coffee. Chuck walked back inside. The hum of conversation didn't return. Not yet. The silence followed him, thick, expectant. He reached his booth, sat down, and picked up his fork. His steak was cold now. That was a shame. Betty approached, hesitating, her voice unsure. Mr. Norris? He looked up. You want me to heat that up for you? Chuck glanced down at his plate, then, casually, he shook his head. No need, he said, and then he took another bite. The silence inside the diner lingered long after Chuck Norris resumed his meal. The air was thick with unspoken words, the kind that no one dared to say in the presence of a man who had just dismantled 6 opponents with the same casual ease that most people used to tie their shoes. Fork in hand, he finished what was left of his steak, chewing slowly, unfazed by the weight of a dozen stares pressing in on him from every corner of the room. Outside, the distant growl of motorcycles faded into the desert horizon, their departure marking the end of something that had never really begun. The waitress, Betty, still stood frozen near the counter, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her grip. A few truckers exchanged quiet glances, their expressions wavering somewhere between admiration and the kind of wariness that only a man who had seen real violence could understand. Nobody said a word. Even the jukebox, which had been sputtering out old country tunes just minutes ago, seemed to have gone silent, as if in respect for the event that had just unfolded. Chuck took another sip of iced tea, set the glass down, and finally pushed his plate away. It had been a decent meal, all things considered. A shame the steak had gone cold, but some things in life couldn't be helped. He adjusted the brim of his hat, took one last look around the diner, and then stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was the first real noise that had been made in several minutes. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Betty flinched, then quickly recovered, blinking as if coming out of a trance. She cleared her throat, then managed a hesitant smile. Mr. Norris, she began, but she was interrupted by the sharp wail of engines roaring back to life. Chuck didn't need to look. He already knew. He sighed, placing a few bills on the table before turning toward the door. Outside, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles echoed across the empty highway. The bikers had come back. Betty's face paled. The truckers stiffened in their seats. The tension, which had barely begun to settle, slammed back into the room like a wave crashing against rocks. Chuck, however, remained utterly calm as he walked toward the entrance, his boot heels tapping against the floor with steady rhythm. This was always how it went. Some people needed one lesson. Others required a second. And then there were the fools, the ones too stupid or too proud to know when they had already lost. The ones who let their bruised egos write checks their bodies couldn't cash. The heavy wooden door swung open and the desert heat rushed inside, hot and dry against the cool air of the diner. Chuck stepped onto the porch, his sharp gaze already sweeping over the scene in front of him. The bikers had returned in force. The same 6 men, now reinforced by at least twice that number. A dozen engines rumbled like thunder across the pavement, kicking up dust in their wake. At the center of it all, the leader of the gang, the man with the skull vest and the broken pride, sat astride his motorcycle. His face was twisted in rage, the bruises already beginning to darken on his skin. His hand was still cradling his wrist, the one Chuck had twisted into submission just moments ago. But now, his expression held none of the fear from before, only a blind, reckless fury. "You should have just walked away, old man," he snarled. Chuck tilted his head slightly, glancing over the assembled riders. More bodies meant more of a mess to clean up. He briefly considered just getting into his truck and leaving, letting them stew in their own failure. But then he saw the way the leader's eyes burned, the way his hand hovered near the gun at his hip. This wasn't going to end with words. It never did. The leader raised his good hand and pointed directly at Chuck. "Get him!" For a single breath, there was no sound. And then they came. The first biker charged forward, heavy boots pounding against the asphalt as he swung a steel pipe toward Chuck's head. Chuck sidestepped effortlessly, letting the weapon sail past his shoulder. Before the man could recover, Chuck caught his wrist, twisted, and sent him tumbling to the ground with a swift shoulder throw. The biker hit the pavement with a sickening thud, his weapon clattering uselessly beside him. The second man came in fast, aiming a wild punch at Chuck's ribs. Chuck didn't bother dodging. Instead, he intercepted the fist mid-swing, his grip tightening like a steel vise around the man's knuckles. A second later, Chuck drove his knee into the biker's gut, doubling him over before delivering a sharp elbow to the side of his head. The man collapsed without another word. The next 2 attacked together, one wielding a chain and the other brandishing a rusted crowbar. Chuck caught the chain as it whipped toward him, wrapping it around his forearm before yanking his opponent forward. The man stumbled, off balance, and Chuck greeted him with a devastating kick to the chest that sent him flying backward. The biker with the crowbar hesitated for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for Chuck to close the distance. One swift strike to the throat, and the man crumpled like a house of cards. The remaining bikers hesitated now, their earlier confidence wavering as they saw their comrades sprawled across the parking lot. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others tightened their grips on their weapons, trying to push down the growing realization that they were fighting something far beyond their comprehension. The leader of the gang, still astride his motorcycle, gritted his teeth. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he roared. "Take him down." 3 more lunged forward. Chuck moved like a storm, each strike precise, each movement honed by years of discipline. He ducked beneath a swinging bat, countered with a brutal palm strike to the attacker's chin. Another came at him with a knife, but Chuck pivoted, twisting the man's wrist until the blade dropped harmlessly to the ground. The last fighter tried to tackle him outright, relying on brute force alone. Chuck barely even shifted as he grabbed the man by the collar and hurled him into the side of a parked motorcycle, sending both crashing to the pavement. The remaining bikers had seen enough. They hesitated, their confidence shattered. Some took a step back, others turned to their leader, searching for an order, for reassurance, anything that might make this situation salvageable. They got nothing. The leader's mouth hung open, his face a portrait of disbelief. His fingers twitched, and for a brief moment, Chuck saw the decision forming in his eyes. He was going for his gun. Chuck moved before he could even touch it. A single, lightning-fast kick sent the leader flying backward off his motorcycle. He landed hard on the ground, the wind knocked clean out of him. The gun never left its holster. A long silence followed. Then, finally, Chuck exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a mild inconvenience. He looked around at the carnage, the broken bodies, the groaning men who had, minutes ago, thought they were invincible. He turned his gaze back to the leader. "You made a fourth mistake," Chuck said. The leader, still wheezing on the ground, barely managed to look up. Chuck's voice remained as steady as ever. "You came back." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the bikers who were still able to move scrambled toward their motorcycles, some dragging their fallen comrades with them, others abandoning them entirely. Engines revved, tires screeched, and then they were gone, vanishing into the desert horizon, smaller and smaller until they were nothing but specks of dust against the sun. Chuck took one last look at the empty parking lot. Then he turned and walked back inside the diner. The silence inside was even heavier than before. Chuck sat down, picked up his fork, and resumed eating his cold steak. The world was quiet once more. The air inside the diner remained still long after the last motorcycle had disappeared over the horizon. The lingering scent of gasoline and burned rubber mixed with the fading echoes of growling engines, but the true weight of what had happened was not in the physical traces left behind. It was in the silence. Heavy, stunned, and absolute. Chuck Norris sat in his booth, cutting another bite of his now fully cold steak. He chewed slowly, unaffected by the destruction outside. Around him, the atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that follows an event too big to fully process. The waitress, Betty, stood behind the counter, gripping a rag so tightly in her hands that her knuckles had turned white. The truckers in the corner whispered among themselves in hushed voices, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something sacred. Even the jukebox, which had been silent for the last few minutes, flickered its neon lights dimly, as if hesitant to reawaken the normal rhythm of life. Chuck didn't acknowledge the stares. He had been through moments like this before, had left scenes like this in his wake more times than he could count. The routine never changed. There was always silence first, then came the questions, the speculation, the stories that would spread long after he had left. He had learned to ignore them. Betty was the first to find her voice. It came out shaky at first, uncertain, but she steadied herself. "You okay?" she asked, as if the question needed asking. Chuck swallowed the bite of steak, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and nodded. "Steak could have been warmer," he said. She let out a nervous, breathless laugh, though it wasn't so much out of amusement as it was the body's natural way of coping with the absurdity of the situation. Her fingers fidgeted with the rag in her hands as she glanced toward the parking lot where the remnants of the battle still lay. The shattered mirror on Chuck's truck, the faint stains of blood on the pavement, the dust unsettled by the stampede of retreating bikers, and the bodies of the ones who hadn't managed to get away. A groan broke through the quiet. One of the bikers, the one with the scar across his cheek, was struggling to push himself up from the pavement. His face was twisted in pain, his body hunched as if curling away from the damage it had taken. His fingers trembled as they dug into the asphalt for support, but his movements were slow, hesitant, like a man who wasn't entirely convinced he was still in one piece. Chuck continued eating. Another biker stirred, this one gripping his ribs, his face pale and contorted. The others, the ones who hadn't managed to drag themselves onto their motorcycles in time to flee, began to shift, some still dazed, others barely conscious. They looked around with the disoriented expressions of men who had woken up in a nightmare they hadn't expected to be real. The leader, the one in the skull vest, hadn't moved. Chuck took another sip of his iced tea. The truckers inside the diner exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older man with a thick mustache, cleared his throat and spoke cautiously. "Think they're going to try anything else?" Chuck set his glass down. "No." The old man studied him for a moment, then nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. A fact, not a prediction, not a guess, just an undeniable truth. Outside, the scarred biker finally managed to get onto his hands and knees. He coughed violently, spitting blood onto the ground before raising his head. His gaze locked onto Chuck through the window, his eyes filled with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't defiance either. It was the expression of a man who had been given a lesson he hadn't wanted, but now understood completely. He turned to the others still on the ground, his voice hoarse. "Get up." The others hesitated, groaning as they attempted to rise. A few barely managed, their bodies too battered to cooperate. One fell back down with a sharp cry, clutching his arm at an unnatural angle. The scarred biker ignored him. His attention was fixed on the leader. The man in the skull vest was still motionless. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven patterns. The fight had been beaten out of him. And not just his body. His pride, his arrogance, his illusion of control, it had all been broken. The scarred man moved toward him, crouching down beside him. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out and gripped the man's shoulder. "Travis." The leader stirred at the sound of his name, blinking sluggishly. His eyes were unfocused, his expression distant, like a man lost in his own defeat. He barely reacted as the scarred biker pulled him up into a sitting position. Chuck watched from his booth, his expression unreadable. Travis finally managed to find his voice, though it was little more than a whisper. We leave." The words came slowly, like he hated saying them, but there was no power left in them. No fight, just the weary acknowledgement of a man who had no other choice. The scarred biker nodded and stood, motioning to the others. "You heard him." No one argued. No one even hesitated. They moved with the quiet, grim efficiency of men who had learned their place the hard way. Those who could walk did so. Those who couldn't were helped up, their arms draped over the shoulders of those who were still standing. Slowly, they began their retreat. Chuck didn't watch them go. He had already seen everything he needed to see. They would leave. They wouldn't come back. Not to this place. Not to him. He had made sure of that. Betty exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Holy hell. Chuck finished his iced tea. Outside, the remaining bikers staggered to their motorcycles, moving with the sluggishness of men still trying to comprehend their own failure. The sound of engines sputtering to life filled the air again, but this time it was different. There was no bravado in it, no arrogance, just the mechanical hum of men who wanted to disappear. Travis, the last to climb onto his bike, turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back toward the diner. His gaze landed on Chuck, still sitting in his booth. His hands gripped the handlebars tighter. His lips parted as if to speak. Then he closed them. He turned back toward the road. A moment later, the remaining bikers pulled out, their motorcycles rolling forward in jerky, uneven movements. They rode off into the desert, their silhouettes growing smaller against the backdrop of endless sand and sun. Then they were gone. Betty let out another shaky breath, finally setting down the rag she had been twisting in her hands. You really don't say much, do you?" she asked, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Chuck looked up at her, considering the question. He shrugged. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Guess you don't need to. The tension in the room finally began to ease. The truckers returned to their conversations, their voices a little louder now, their tones tinged with the kind of energy that only came from witnessing something legendary. The jukebox, as if sensing permission had been granted, crackled back to life, a slow country tune drifting through the air. Chuck sat back in his seat, the weight of the moment settling. It was over. Outside, the parking lot was empty once more, the desert wind already working to erase the signs of what had happened. The only thing left behind was a story, one that would be told and retold by those who had seen it with their own eyes. Chuck Norris picked up his fork and resumed eating his steak. The distant growl of the last motorcycle faded into the desert, swallowed by the vast emptiness beyond the highway. The parking lot, once filled with the stench of gasoline and the arrogance of men who had thought themselves invincible, was now silent. The dust settled, erasing the last traces of the gang that had stormed in like they owned the place, only to leave battered and broken. Inside the diner, the air still held the weight of what had just transpired. The truckers resumed their meals, their voices low, their conversations tinged with something that wasn't quite disbelief, because disbelief required the possibility that what had happened was impossible. And, after what they had just seen, there was no denying it had been real. Betty, still clutching a damp rag, stood behind the counter, her eyes flicking to the man sitting at the far booth. Chuck Norris remained where he was, finishing the last bite of his cold steak as if the events of the last half hour were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His iced tea was nearly empty, a single sliver of ice floating at the bottom of the glass. He picked it up, took one last sip, and set it down with the same calm deliberation that had defined his every movement since the moment he'd walked through the diner's doors. Betty hesitated for a moment, then slowly stepped forward. She wiped her hands on her apron and cleared her throat. "Mr. Norris?" He looked up, his gaze steady but not unkind. "You, She glanced outside at his truck, at the shattered side mirror, the deep scratches along the paint, the slashed tires that had left the vehicle sagging slightly to one side. "You sure you're all right?" Chuck nodded once. "Truck needs work." Betty let out a short, breathless laugh, shaking her head. "Yeah, I'd say so." She hesitated again as if weighing her next words carefully. "You need me to call a tow? Nearest shop's a few miles down the road." Chuck didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills and slid them across the table. Enough to cover the meal. More than enough. "I'll handle it." Betty didn't argue. Somehow she knew that was the only response she was going to get. She glanced out the window again at the black Ford, beaten but still standing. Like its owner. One of the truckers, a burly man with a thick mustache and oil-stained fingers, leaned back in his seat, studying Chuck with a look that was equal parts respect and curiosity. "I've seen a lot of fights in my time," he said. "Seen a lot of tough men, too." He shook his head. "Ain't never seen anything like that." Chuck didn't respond. The trucker exhaled, resting his elbows on the table. "That gang, the Black Vultures, they've been raising hell in these parts for a while now. Nobody ever stood up to 'em like that." He glanced out the window as if expecting them to come back despite knowing they wouldn't. "Ain't nobody gonna forget what happened here today." Chuck reached for his hat, adjusting it slightly before standing up. His movements were slow, deliberate, but carried the effortless certainty of a man who had already decided what came next. "Nothing to remember," he said. The trucker chuckled under his breath. "I reckon folks are going to disagree." Chuck ignored him. He stepped away from the booth, leaving the diner behind as he walked toward the parking lot. The midday sun hung heavy overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The dry heat wrapped around him, but he didn't pay it any mind. He had spent a lifetime under harsher conditions in places where the sun was merciless and the air carried the weight of danger. The damage to his truck was significant, but not beyond repair. The slashed tires were the worst of it. The rest? Scratches, dents, a broken mirror, cosmetic damage, nothing more. He had seen worse. A moment later, the diner door swung open behind him. Betty stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the glare. "I meant it, you know. About the toe." Chuck knelt beside the nearest damaged tire, running his fingers along the rubber. The gash was deep, the kind that didn't happen by accident. The kind that only a man looking to make a statement would leave behind. He glanced toward the road, toward the dust trail left behind by the fleeing gang. "They'll think twice next time," Betty said, following his gaze. Chuck shook his head. "There won't be a next time." Betty studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She believed him. Chuck stood, stretching slightly before walking to the back of his truck. He unlatched the storage compartment, pulling out a heavy-duty jack and a spare tire. Betty's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You carry your own spares?" Chuck set the jack down, positioning it under the truck. "Always prepared." Betty smirked. "Figures." She watched as he worked, changing the tire with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. No wasted movement, no hesitation, just purpose. The truckers inside the diner continued watching, some through the windows, others stepping outside to get a better view. None of them offered to help. Not out of rudeness, not because they didn't want to, but because they knew it wasn't necessary. Chuck Norris didn't need help. When the last tire was changed, Chuck wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back, surveying his work. The truck was still scarred, still bore the marks of the battle it had endured, but it was ready to move. Betty crossed her arms. "Where are you headed?" Chuck secured the storage compartment and turned toward the road. "Wherever it takes me." Betty nodded, as if that was the only answer she had expected. "Well, if you're ever in these parts again, stop by. Next stake's on the house." Chuck gave the faintest hint of a nod. Then, without another word, he climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, deep and steady. The truckers stepped back as he pulled out of the lot, the massive vehicle rolling forward, carrying its scars with quiet pride. Betty watched until the truck was nothing more than a black dot against the desert horizon. Then she turned back toward the diner, shaking her head with a soft smile. Inside, the jukebox played again. Conversations resumed. Life moved on. But this story would remain. Chuck Norris had come. He had seen, and he had left behind a lesson that no one would ever forget. Out on the highway, the road stretched endlessly before him, an open path leading to wherever fate decided to take him next. He drove without hurry, without destination. Because for men like him, the road never ended. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out other videos on the channel and share this one with your friends.